There's occasionally been a lack of research funding for acoustics science, perhaps, in the past. Is it just that as acousticians, we're just rubbish at writing proposals, or is there a perception problem for acoustics, or have all the major questions been answered for acoustics? Is it just a mature science?
I don't think there's a lack as such. I think there is perhaps a lack of imagination. If you go to a scientific conference, your first one is great. You think, oh God, look at all this stuff. I'm being educated with everything I see. And by the time you're at the 20, you think, oh, all the same. Everyone's doing the same thing. They're studying the same hot topic, metamaterials, acoustic tweezers, things like that. It's just topics in acoustics. They're all studying the same thing, same way, same lab, same equipment. And I think the sponsors know what is good science because they know what they expect to fund. And so I think it's a lack of imagination. And I think people love to say that they're like high risk, high reward. That's what they want to fund, something that's going to give a huge reward, but it's high risk, high adventure. But they don't. They want safe and probably going to lead to a couple of research papers. And I think that's the mentality. There is no risk. Nobody wants to put funds to something that stands a good chance of being utterly crazy. But if you go always for the highest priority, you only ever do one thing. And I think that's the disease we have, is we always say priority. In acoustics, it'd be metamaterials. Medicine, it's cancer. Be overtaken one day by dementia. You know, how many of you have put money into a cancer charity? And how many of you ever been asked by somebody putting a dog charity? You say, no, dogs. Yeah, cancer, it's more important than dogs. It is, but it should only be more important than dogs 9 times out of 10. And that 10th penny should go into the other thing. And I think that's the problem, is that we have a lack of courage.
Yeah, I'll take a slightly different angle. I think the issue sound has is something that Damon Dowling kind of described. We're so ubiquitous, sound is absolutely everywhere, we're kind of in a sense a bit invisible. So because we're not climate change, we're not, some of those big headline issues, we're always kind of a minor player in lots of areas. And as someone bidding for funding, over recent years, probably last decade, there's been more and more encouragement for big funding run on big projects. And it's quite hard for acoustics people to run those big projects because you're more likely to be collaborating as a player alongside the others. And so I think there's a sort of kind of funding model problem that acoustics falls into. And I think there's other problems that we have as well. We have to accept that we're a visual dominated creature who think first of all visually. And so I don't know how many times I've been asked for people in VR to say, can you come along and sort my sound out? I don't want to do any research in sound, but my system sounds awful in my VR cave. They're not really, they're favouring the visual over the acoustic. And I think that happens quite naturally. So just go and look on a funder like EPSRC, how many projects there are about vision. There are vast numbers, and then count up the number of projects in audio, there's a small number. And I think that just reflects society's bias. And I think we can bemoan it, but I don't think it's going to change, unfortunately.
Well, the only thing I would add to that is one thing that acoustics could benefit from is good communicators. And I think we've got 2 of them here. I know that some of the physics departments in universities talk about the Brian Cox effect, that more kids want to do physics because it's been on the TV and it's been well communicated to them. I think the 2 speakers here certainly are good advocates for acoustics. I hope you agree with me on that. The second question I've got, slightly more technical this time. The effect of, I wanted to ask you what your opinions were on the effect of imperceptible sound. The word sound, most people when they use it, people in the street would think of it as something that you can hear. But of course we know that the frequency ranges stretch well beyond the capabilities of human hearing. I even read a paper recently by, I can't remember who it was now, it was quite a learned journal, someone talking about the effect of ultrasound in air. And I thought to myself, how can anything affect you if you can't even hear it? So, and of course we also have the opposite end of the scale with infrasound, and people claiming this affects their emotions, or it affects the way they feel about things, even explaining ghost stories in houses and things this way. So I wondered if you had any thoughts of the influence or effect of imperceptible sound.
Yeah. I was that author. That was my Kamala moment. Yeah, about 2015, people started coming to me and they said, I've been around my doctors, I've been around my audiology, I hear noises, they're not there, and I've just been told to go away, it's in my head. So I looked at it and went to the places where they heard noises, and there was ultrasound in there. I checked this room out, there isn't in this room. But it turns out there's an awful lot of places where ultrasound is put in air. Speakers like this, not so much these, but the ones mounted in the ceiling, the public address voice alarm, the one that say, get out this building, there's a bomb, those kind of ones. By European law, we have to have 90% of them working at any one time in a building. And the way they work is they send a signal to each other, and that just emits quite a powerful 20 kilohertz tone. Pest deterrents, door openers, there's a lot in various places. And these people were sensitive. Why were people putting signals out? Because it was felt no one could hear them, so it couldn't harm them. So this was a region of radiation space we could use. It was open for technical opportunities, so that, for example, I'm going to a hotel room after, if I put on my television and I want to watch a program that I don't want anyone ever to know I ever watched, I turn off my phone. Because, you don't want anyone ever monitoring you. So what they embed now in adverts and things, a little beep, 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 Morse code in ultrasound. Your phone microphone picks it up, remembers it. And then next time you connect to the internet, it tells Seattle what you were watching. So there's a lot of these things going on. Lots of little sensors all the time. These people were hearing it. And the reason they were hearing it is we can't get this idea that people can hear up to 20 kilohertz, but as you get older, you lose those higher frequencies. That's not true. I've tested, I'm not personally tested. I've collaborated with people who've tested. Young people can hear up to 28 kilohertz. And your 1 in 20 people in their 50s is very much more sensitive at 20 kilohertz than your average person in the 40s. Because your ear is such a remarkable instrument, and I think it's because it has such a large dynamic range. You can hear very quiet and very loud things. That it varies. It's such a finely tuned instrument. It's huge variation between people. And so there are people who can hear these sounds that other people can't. And we've got a space, opportunity space, where people with instruments will use it. There was a point I was going to make. How could it affect you? So I started published like this and said, look, people could be possibly damaged by this. People said, well, how could you be harmed by something you can't hear? Because there's one thing for people to feel ill effects from something they can hear, and one thing that they can't hear. When you can hear it, I don't think it's the sound doing it. I think there's a loudness of sound at a particular frequency where you can hear it, and there's a loudness of sound where it causes you distress. This is your Gary Glitter rock noise concerts, and this is your just about audible noise in audio frequencies. As you go to higher frequencies, on this scale, it's hard, your threshold goes up. It's harder to hear the quiet noises. This threshold can't keep up at the same rate. So your usable band becomes very small. So as you get to the limit of your hearing, almost the moment you hear something, you find it distressing. And I think what happens is it causes stress and tension here, which leads to headaches, because the classic symptoms are headaches, nausea, tinnitus, dizziness, these kind of things. So, because naturally, when the Cuban Embassy was purportedly attacked by ultrasound, a phone call rang, and it was people representing the American government wanted to know, well, was it? And I gave them an honest, truthful answer, and I put the phone down, and honest, truthful, it rang and it was Cuba asking for the same advice, was it? Now, and I told them all the same thing. I said, look, if I wanted to make this room, if I wanted to give ill effects for people from ultrasound in this room, you remember the case, the Cuban Embassy, ultrasonic attack, they said. If I wanted to make this room a target of an ultrasonic attack, I could do it. I could put devices in this room and they would make 20% if you feel quite ill, and the rest would be completely unaffected. Yes?
Can it be positive instead of a
No,
negative effect?
no, it's a good question, but I've never noticed a positive effect, no. But the people who are affected, generally, it's the grey old men like him who are the most robust against ultrasonic attacks, and it's going to be your younger, more female people. So as a way of attacking an embassy, it's not the most effective way generally if you're going to assume that it's old men who do the ambassadorial duties as a tendency. And you certainly can't propagate it through range, through a distance. So I could do that, but so I could do it, but was it the case that? No, there's no evidence it was. They sent the people who... it's quite hard to get the data. What happened was 80 people complained. They looked at those 80 people, the government in America, and they threw away almost all of them and chose the 16 that had the right set of symptoms for an ultrasonic attack. So they threw away 80% of the data points because they didn't fit their predetermined conclusion. They then scouted around a bit and found 4 more. So they ended up with, was it 8 more? Found it with 20, I think it was 24 people. And then they sent them to Penn State University for tests, and they had brain scans and all sorts of tests done, and they talked about white matter in the brain and this kind of thing. And sadly, basically more than 90% of us would also come out as having abnormalities, because they set the threshold for failing the test so low that, say, most people, 9 out of 10 people, ordinary people, would have failed it as well. So I'm afraid that the politicians, I think, had an agenda there, and the data, I feel really gutted when there's poor science done, but there's poor science with the data to make it appear as if people had been affected. I think it could well have been a kind of hysteria thing.
I think it's really interesting, a cautionary tale for anyone who does do media work and science work, that people ring you up to ask you about this, and by even commenting on whether it could be a sonic attack, you're lending credence to the story, because in the headlines, sonic attack will be in inverted commas, but most people will kind of ignore that. So when I appeared on Inside Science, I basically talked about how I thought, given the agenda of the politics at the moment, that they wanted to have a fight with Cuba to change the policy towards Cuba. Wasn't it kind of coincidence that there was this attack which couldn't be traced and was using sound? And sonic weapons have got a long history of pseudoscience and rubbish in it, basically, that it wasn't a coincidence. And I think as scientists, when we rung up, especially if you're looking at the current American administration, and I'm sadly to say probably the current UK administration, don't take the data they give you at face value. We're asked as scientists to explain it. I think we ought to be first of all saying, where is the evidence you're basing it on? Not a few spokesmen have said this to you and you're taking it at face value. We ought to say, first of all, as scientists, we have to work with good data. And if it's just some hearsay, we have to be really careful about commenting on it without saying we don't know if that data is any good.
Question quickly about the era of fake speech, which you hinted at, Trevor. I mean, is there any work going on to apply objective metrics to voice recordings such that we might actually be able to tell whether it really is Donald Trump talking sense about climate change, or do we have to use the context and so on to determine it, or is it always going to be subjective?
I think there's a very simple decision tree. If Donald Trump plus climate change equals false, I think would be the all you need. So yes, there's in the signal processing, there's a sort of arms race going on between those who are creating, individualized speech synthesis and those who are trying to detect it. And you can do it already for imaging, but the problem at the moment is it's usually quite a slow process to detect it. So if you really want to find out whether someone has faked a photo in Photoshop, you can usually work it out, but it is not an automated process. It involves quite a lot of human intervention. And they look at things like, if it's been two pictures have been put together, the sort of colour coding used in, say, the JPEG compression is different, and they can see there's different compression algorithms being used. And it's similar to a voice. You'd look for different bits of the voice not fitting in some way. There are detection algorithms around, but they're only as good as the fake voices they've been trained on. So there can only ever be one step behind at the moment, which is why it's an arms race at the moment.